Hello everybody and welcome back to our internet programming class. And today I'll be talking about using user input validation controls to control the data that users will enter um, as requested by the form. The objectives of this lecture, and if we can't finish it, would be continued in the next lecture, are to cover the, these points, basically to know what is the importance of using user input validations and validating user inputs, how ASP.NET 4 allows users to validate information, allows your website to validate user informations, and also how to work with built-in validation controls. And I'll show you in a couple of programs that I will write how you can use these. Then we'll see how we can send this information that users input as an email message using ASP.NET features, and finally how to read text files and work with them, basically to create more custom designed user messages. There are several ways that we can create our web pages more user-friendly and attractive. What we have seen so far is basically creating fairly static websites, and we have controls in all the layouts that are created, and we have contents that are added to these fixed pages, and we allowed users the last time to choose between a couple of features, essentially a couple of themes, and apply the themes to their websites. And I had in the discussion board a discussion as to why my themes didn't work, and if you have not answered it yet, several answers came back in, and basically the reason for it was that in one of the files I actually typed the name of the cookie, so it wasn't ever being read by the browser, and of course my base page was not actually applied, so the pages that I created were inheriting from the system config web pages. What I needed to do is to click on the default page code behind file and make it inherit from the base page that I designed, and also correct the name of my cookie. But we can even go further than that by making our websites more attractive by using dynamic data. And the dynamic data basically flow, or actually data flow from the server to the browser, to the client, or from the client to the server. So if you think of data that comes from the server and be sent to the browser, you could think of database files and also files that are stored within dynamic data controls. And dynamic data controls that ASP.NET provides basically allow the manipulation of this kind of data that comes from the server. The other flow of the data that comes from the user basically is sent from the client machine in the web browser to the server. The scope of this information is basically large, and it can range from simple page requests or to complex contact us forms, to even further complicated shopping cart scenarios and wizard-like user inputs. And whenever users enter data or choose between several allowable choices, then they would send this information to the user. Understanding the principle of this essentially data communication that comes from the client and sends to the user basically is performed by the user inputting the information, and either a piece of code that automatically sends this information to the server, or basically the click of a button that would submit this information to the user, to the server. And there are several issues that we might encounter when servers basically receive invalid data, and for this reason it is very important to validate this data before we can allow the server to work with this information. For example, maybe a piece of code that the server works with the user input data requires the data to be of an integer type, for example. And if the data sent by the user contains text, then the code would crash and the page would not be available anymore to the users. Fortunately, ASP.NET 4 comes with a variety of tools to allow user validation or data validation basically to become a very simple task. The paradigm here is basically we never should trust user input. This sounds like paranoia, but if you think about it, in an open system, it is fairly important for you to keep your system safe and also secure and efficient by thinking of the security of the public data that is provided on public web pages, and everybody could access these web pages. Therefore, they are very susceptible to attacks from hackers and those potential users who basically might not might do harm to either the data stored on your servers and also the processes that you perform as a part of your web services. Another issue is essentially not really letting the users to accidentally enter information that the server will not be able to process. So even the most trustworthy users may basically provide incorrect data to the server by accident. On top of it, there are also situations that you might require a piece of information from the user, but the users may not remember that this is a required piece of information, and so your website's lacking the required information from the user may not be able to process their requests. ASP.NET hosts several validation controls that help you validate user data before you can use it in your application, and we will see that these validation controls in a little while today. And these validation controls are essentially simple tools, and they can be used efficiently like any other server controls that we have been working with so far. Before we talk about the validation controls, let's look back again a little bit about how the information is sent from the user to a server. Every web page in the internet has to deal basically with input from the users. This input can be sent in a variety of number of ways, and the most known and commonly used methods by which the data is sent to the server are the get and the post methods. And we have seen so far that the get data appends the actual data into the actual address of the page, and the post method basically sends the entire body of the request for the page. So if you look at the get method, it actually adds the data to the requested URL, and this data is basically can be retrieved by using the query string property of the request object. So there is as you saw earlier, when you're dealing with data flow back and forth from the user to the server and back, you could use request and response objects. Request objects request data from the browser, essentially, because now we're setting at a server side, and a response object would send the data out to the browser, and we saw how we could request a cookie, for example, from the browser. But if we're requesting, for example, this page a.b.com/view.asp.x, the data that this page would send to the server is bundled within name and value pairs, and these name value pairs are essentially separated, if you have multiple, separated by the ampersand, and the entire query string is the string that is appended right after the question mark in the URL of the page. So to receive this data, what you will do is that essentially you look and see each of these pairs of name value contains an equal sign, and the equal sign would basically tell you that the value for the review ID here item is basically 34. That's the user had entered the value 34. And for category ID, the user had entered value 13. Because you had two, they are separated by this ampersand. And finally, if you want to access this information within your websites, you could basically, in your C# codes, code behind file, you could use the get method of the query string. So, for example, to put the value from review ID, the user input from the review ID, you could use the convert to int 32, basically because these things are string. You change this string that you will be reading with the get method into an integer to put it into an integer variable because you're expecting an integer number, and your variable here is review ID, and you use the request object, its query string method, and the get method of the query string, and what you are requesting actually to get is rev ID, which is the ID of that particular text box which was on the form, for example, and I'll show you how it actually works. Or you could use the category ID to get this information, which is number 13. On the other hand, the post method is simple, and what it does is that it gets this data from a form with all of the controls that have been submitted to the server being already populated and having values in them. So if you, for example, wanted to have a text list, you had a text box in your web form, and it had an ID called age, and you would put integer numbers for the age of a person or the user into this text box, and then you would press a button to submit this information to the browser. To get the information basically from the form, if it has been sent by the post method, you basically click, you put on the, for example, the submit button's C# code, you would simply read the value of the text of the text box called age and convert it into integer 32 or int 32, and you put it into the user age variable, which is an integer variable. Notice that in this case there's no need to access a collection like form that you saw in the query string earlier. The ASP.NET here shields you from the complexity of manually having to retrieve data from the submitted form. All you need to do is just to call up the object that you want its information and look at, if it's a text box, for example, and look at its text. If it has value, call up its value properties and work with them. Everything works well as long as the data submitted by the user is of correct format or it's actually valid. If the user enters an invalid data, submits an invalid data, either deliberately or by accident, then your server would have problem processing this information. For example, if your user, instead of entering an integer number for age, types in my age is 38, then the convert process or the convert object that you saw in the piece of code here in the middle of the page would throw an exception because, or basically an error, because it cannot parse and convert a string into an integer when the string does not contain or is not convertible into an integer number. Or there may be other possible exceptions and problems that your server might need to deal with. So for this reason, we need to basically validate all the data that is being sent from the user to the browser to avoid these kind of problems. So when the data is not valid or doesn't appear to be valid, then we want the browser to be able to reject this data, or the server to be able to reject this data before it starts processing them. ASP.NET 4 has 6 useful controls to perform validation in the websites. 5 of these controls perform actual validations, and the final one, which is a validation summary, is used to provide feedback to the user about any error that has been made in the page. And the validation controls are very helpful in validating the data that user enters into the system. You can easily use them and hook them up to any kind of controls, such as text box or drop-down lists or any other control you would like to validate. But they also support custom validation scenarios, and we'll see how we can actually create custom validation scenarios. Basically, they range from required item validation to text validations and range validations and so forth. The great thing about the validation controls is that they can check the input both at the client side and at the server side. When we add a validation control to a web page, we can write a JavaScript that basically validates the associated control at the client. This client validation is useful and works well on most of the modern browsers that have their JavaScript enabled. And these browsers include Internet Explorer, Chrome, Opera, Firefox, and so forth. At the same time, you can use the validation controls to also carry out validations at server automatically. This makes it easy to provide your users with an immediate feedback about the data that are sent to the or is sent to the server from your web pages. There's a piece of warning about validating on the on the client side. Although it seems that at first that is enough to prevent users from sending invalid data to the system, we should never rely on it as just the only means of validating the information. Because first of all, it's easy to disable JavaScript, and many users prefer to disable JavaScripts probably for security reasons. And this renders the client-side validation routines pretty much useless. Also, if users who are advanced and malicious, they can easily bypass the entire page and just send the information to the browser directly, to the server directly, without having to render the page on the browser. And the server, if it doesn't take into account any countermeasures, it would accept this information and process them. The validation will not happen. In general, what we need to do is to take countermeasures in validating all the information on the server side. But just as a courtesy to the user, we could provide the user with client-side validation so that they would get immediate feedback if they forgot to, for example, put a required field item, or if they entered an incorrect data type, without having to fully post back the information to the server and wait for the server to send them the validation back. So basically, this server-side validation is the only means to really validate the information truly on the server and make sure that everything works and is valid. Using validation controls is very simple. You can declare them exactly like the other validation, other server controls that you used, and then simply attach them to the controls that you are validating. And if they need additional information, such as the text that they would send out as if a validation error occurred to the user, and so forth. And I will show you now here how you could use these validation controls. And so what we will do is that we will create a web page and ASP.NET page, and then replace a couple of text boxes and validation controls for the user to, for example, enter their name, and then we'll add a button to this website or web page that the user could send their name by pressing on the button. Okay, so let's start writing a program that shows us how we can actually manage to create um, an ASP.NET web page that uses the validation controls. So first of all, I'll create a new website by clicking on new website icon, and then let's have it an empty ASP.NET, and let's call this website validation. And then click OK. So the website is created, and I will add new item to my website. It will be a web form, and it will be my default, and it's basically C# code is behind file. Okay, now let's give this website a web page a title. And within the title, let's create a table with 8 rows and 3 columns. So we'll go to the design view, and in the design view, click on table, or actually let's click on the table tab on top, and then click table, and then click insert table, and then let's make 8 rows and 3 columns. Okay. For the first 3 columns of the first row, we will merge them together, and we will put some basic information about what we are requesting the users to do. We merge these cells, and then we go ahead and we put text box and labels and validators in the other rows and cells. So to merge the first 3 cells, you need to left click and drag all the 3 rows, and then right click on them and click on the modify, and then click on the merge cells. So this way these cells are merged. Now let's type some common sense text in there. Let's put a heading 1. I'll go back to the design view here, and so in this cell, as you see, its column span is now 3. I would type in basically within an H1 heading and then a line break, and then fill the following form and send the information to us by pressing the submit button. Okay, so let me render this page in the browser. Okay, so the page is now being rendered in the browser, and the first column of the or the first row of the table, which is the result of the merging of the 3 columns, has been essentially filled up. And now in the next columns of the table, I would put a label, or basically some text, and then I'll add some information to the ID, or basically the text box that users would put their names in, and then I'll add a required field validator from the validation category toolbox of the ASP Visual Web Developer. So let's go back to the Visual Web Developer, and let's put in the second row, the first column, the text name, and then in the next column drag a text box, if I can find it. There it is. And let's call this text box name. And finally, I would need to drag a validation object. So the validation object is within the validation category, which is right here. So let's make it a required field validator, which is this fourth one. So drag the required field validator and put it in the third column of this page. So required field validator goes in there. Now, if you notice, this required field validator basically is an item, an ASP server control item, that sends an error message, which basically says required field validator, when the user submits the page without basically entering information in the control that this validator needs to validate. Okay, so what we will need to do now for this required field validator to work well is to essentially click on the validator, and then in its properties grid, which basically is to the right left of the bottom right portion of the Visual Web Developer's environment, add a CSS class to it, basically give an error message to the required field validator. It's already here that you could change it, give it a text, and give it a control to validate. So I'll show you how to use these validation controls basically by going to its properties grid. So click on the design view, click on the required field validator, and then at the bottom right corner of the page you will see the required field validator properties grid. And what we will need to do is to change its error message to a more representative message. For example, type your name, and then make a CSS class for it, and I would make a error message class, and finally give it a text. And where is this text? Down here. Let's put the star, and finally we will need to make it validate a particular control, and that would be control to validate. And what control do you want it to validate is basically the field that whose ID was name. So we provide this information. Let's go back to design to the source view, and here is again the validator. So it's a required field validator 1, it's its ID. It runs its server. It basically, its error message is type your name. The control to validate is name, which is this control, and its CSS class is essentially error message. Now I want this validator essentially to show the message in red. So what you need to do is in the style section here, if you had a CSS file, you could use the CSS external file, just using embedded, and make it color equals red, semicolon. So so here's our required field validator that we have added to the website, and let's run this website now. Okay, now I have the text that was written in the first row of the table, and I have the name row and the text box that I will be validating. And the validator validation control doesn't show anything because the page has not been submitted to the server. Now I need to add a button at the end of this table. Let's add the button to the second column of the last row, and I need to bring in a button control. And let's call this submit and submit. Okay, now let's run the page back in the browser. Alright, now I have the name and the text box, and if I press the submit button, the page is sent to the server, and the server in very early stages of the pages cycle and processing processes the validation control, says that this required field is empty, nothing is in it, and therefore it sends the text of the error out. Now notice that it didn't send the error message, it sent the text. The difference between the error message and the text is that the text will be submitted as the validation control's response, exactly where the validation control is in your website. And you can use asterisk, for example, as a required field notification. But the error message will be sent to a validation summary control that we will be talking about a little later, and in there you could summarize all the error messages that you got. Now if you wanted this text also right now here to show an error message, you could put the message in the text. So let's go back to this validation control, and let's change the text from star to another value. So text equals type your message, and I will put a period at the end of this text message just to show you that these text messages and error messages are different. So let's rerun the page. Okay, now I have again the same thing. If I press submit, it type your message, period. It's the text that was sent here, not the error message. And I'll show you the error message when we are summarizing all the errors that are made. So if I type a name and then submit, the name will be submitted to the server and the error message will not be shown. Okay, in the previous example that I showed you, you saw that the required field validator control validates a control like a text box, and what it does is that it compares the value of this control, the text box control, with its own initial value property, and makes sure that the control it's validating has a different value from its initial value property. By default, the property is set as empty. So unless the user enters a value in the text box, the control will see that the initial value has not changed, and therefore it notices that the control, the required field is not set up, and the text is not present in it. So when the text box is still empty, the asterisk that was in the text property of the required field validator control would show using the CSS class, styling the text and showing it in place of the validation control where it actually was located on the website. And the error message didn't show up because the error message will be sent out to the validation summary, as I will talk about it a little later. Besides the required field validator, there are other validators in the category of validation in the toolbox of Visual Web Developer. The 5 validation controls that are basically the standard validation controls, ultimately all of them inherit from the same base class, and therefore they share common behaviors. 4 of these 5 validation controls operate pretty much in the same way and contain built-in behaviors that enable you to validate associated controls. The last control, which is called the custom validation control, basically enables you to write custom validation rules that are not supported in built in. These are the properties and the description of each of these properties that your validation controls have and basically behave. The display property determines whether or not the hidden error message should take up space. You can make this display set to static or dynamic. If you put it as static, the error message takes up screen space, and even if when it is hidden and the validation has not been done or has passed. Basically, this is similar to the CSS setting of visibility equals hidden that we saw earlier. The dynamic setting hides the error message until basically it has to be set. And when you set the setting as none, the error message is not visible at all. So you won't see it even if the validation is not passed. This is useful when you are using a validation summary control to basically show all of the errors later, or at the same time in a sort of summary format. The CSS class property enables you to set the CSS class attribute that you want to apply to the error message to modify the way it looks. Error message property is the error message that will be used in the validation summary, and we will see that a little later. If you leave the text property of the validation control empty, then the error message will show up as the text. The text property is used as a text validation control and is displayed where the validation control is located. So you can combine the text property and the error message together to basically put, for example, an asterisk next to the controls that are not that failed, and in the summary, in the validation summary, show the error message of all the controls whose validation has failed. The control to validate property is the server ID of the control that you want to validate. So for example, the text box ID that we had was name. So the control to validate in the validation control, we put it equal to name. Enable client script property determines whether the control provides validation at the client side. This is by default true. Set focus on error property determines whether client-side script should give the focus to the first control that generated the error. By default, this setting is false. Validation group basically groups all some of the validation controls together, and this allow you to perform validation against a section of the controls. They put a bunch of controls that you want to validate at the same time. All of the controls within the same validation group are checked at the same time. That means that controls that are not part of the group are not checked now. And this is actually useful when you have several sections in your code and you want to control to validate their values separately. So for example, let's say that you have a username password block, you have a username text box, a password text box, and a button for login, and then you have a search text box. Now let's say that when you press the login button, you want only to check for the username and password and not enforce the validations over other sections of your code. So this way you could you could group your validation controls together. As valid property typically is not designed and set at the design time. In the runtime, you will use this to basically get information about whether the validation has passed or not. So you could use this property in a custom validation to perform those kinds of validations. Before we go further, let me again re-emphasize the difference between the text property and the error message property. In a validation control, if you leave the text empty, the error message will show up where the validation control is on the website if the validation fails. If you provide text within the text property, then if the validation fails, the text will show up where the validation control is located on the website or on the web page. And the error message will be kept and used in the validation summary control. So basically this means that if you have a set of items that you want to validate, and then you want to show all of the error message for all those items whose validation has failed in a sort of summary like format, you could set up their texts as an asterisk or a symbol that shows that that text, for example, was required or didn't pass the criteria for validation. And then you could set up the validation summary control that shows all of the validation error messages for the different validators. Besides the required field validator that we saw earlier, there are other validators, and I'll just go ahead and talk about them a little bit and tell you how they are used and where you can use them. The second validator that is widely used is called a range validator. This validator checks to see if the value of the control it's validating falls within a certain range. And it could check different data types like strings, numbers, dates, currencies. Numbers could be integers, doubles, floating points, and so forth. For example, you can make sure by checking to see if a number is between 1 and 10, or it's between a range of currencies. The properties that this control has are essentially, aside from the common properties, are minimum value, maximum value, and type. Minimum value selects the minimum of the range that you're checking. Maximum would be again maximum, and finally the type tells the validation control to control against what kind of data type. You can set it to strings, integers, doubles, date, or currency. The next type of validator is called a regular expression validator. This controls to see if a value is of a particular format or pattern, which is called a regular expression. So the value that it is controlling is going to be compared against a regular expression that you could set into the validation expression property of this control. Regular expressions are compact syntax that enable you to search for patterns in text strings, for example, zip codes or email addresses or phone numbers that usually are written within a certain type format. For example, all emails will have a @ sign and 2 dots, for example. So you could set these up in terms of regular expressions. Details about regular expressions are far more advanced than we could fit in this class. And but essentially, Visual Web Developer contains several built-in expressions that make it easy for you to validate values such as email addresses and zip codes and phone numbers. Finally, The compare validator is a validator that can be used to compare the value of one control to another. So the control to compare to validate is the control that whose values is compared against another control, and the control to compare is the ID of the server control that the validator compares its results. You can set this property to make sure that you compare two different server controls values. If you set this value, then the value to compare, which is the last property in this table, will not be checked. It will not have any effect because control to compare overrides the value to compare values. This is useful for comparing, for example, two text boxes containing email addresses to make sure that the user typed the email address correctly both times, or when they're asking for password, we can ask for password twice in two different text boxes and then compare the two text boxes together to see if they are equal. You can even control the value of a server control with a constant value. If you're, for example, asking for a specific specific value, which basically essentially you can think of it as a range validator with only one range or one value in the range. The operator here property essentially determines the type of comparison operation, or it's a logical operation such as equal, greater than equal, less than equal, and so forth that you could use. Okay, let me just go ahead and expand our example that we just started by basically extending the form that adds fields such as email addresses, home phone numbers, business phone numbers, and give a text box for the users to be able to send comments to us in the contact sheet. And then we make sure that the users enter correct email addresses, they enter basically their phone numbers and business numbers and so forth in a correct format. Okay, so in here, what I'm going to show you is I'm going to expand on the form and extend it and add fields for an email address, a phone number for home, and a business phone number. And I'll add validation controls to ensure that the email address is in a valid format and that at least one of the two phone numbers is filled in to make sure that users enter the correct email address. They will basically ask for it twice, and we compare and use compare validators to make sure that the emails are essentially presented in and they are actually the correct email address, although we check for them to see if they are in the correct format. You want to make sure that they are basically also right email addresses, and the user didn't put typos or essentially made any typing mistakes when they were entering the email addresses. So I'll drag 5 additional text boxes in the second columns, and I'll put basically one of them for email address and confirm email address, home phone, business phone, and comments. So the first one will be email. Let's make these bold. Confirm email. Phone, home phone, business phone, comments. Okay, Let me go to the design and let's get rid of all these styles. Oh, anyway, that's one reason I really don't like design mode, because it just keeps adding styling when I make any style changes. Anyway, so let's add to the second columns some text boxes. Okay, go to the source code and let's make the IDs of these text boxes. So the first text box will be email, address. This text box will be confirm email, phone, home, phone, business. And this text box will be comments. Okay, for the comments section, I need to make the text box text property of the control multi-line so that users can add more than one line of comments in the text box. Let's move down here and let's select the comments. And in the properties, find the multi-line property. Okay. Oh yeah, the text mode property, and the text mode property should be multi-line. And this way users can enter several lines of text in the comment section. Okay. Let me make the comment box a little larger, and like that. Now in the last cell of each row I will bring the validators. So for the last cell next to the email, I would drag a required field validator because I want the user to enter their email address. And for the same expression, I would drag a regular expression also, because I want to make sure that the email address is in a correct format. Next to this cell with the second email address, I'll put a compare validator, and this confirms or compares the email address with the confirm email address to make sure that the email addresses are also in a correct, or basically the email address is not only just in the correct format, but it's also the right email address. And finally, and last cell for the comments row, I would bring a required field validator so that the users would also enter the data in the comments section and won't leave it empty. Now for each of these 5 validation controls that we just added, we open their property grids and set the text property to an asterisk, and the display property to dynamic, and the CSS class to error message. Because we have 5 validator controls right now here, I could set them up individually, or I could control and left click on all of them, and this way all of them will be selected. And then I'll go to the property grid and change the CSS class for all of these properties to error message that I created. The display property for these validators, I change it to dynamic. Remember, the dynamic would show the text when the validators would basically fail to pass the test, and otherwise they wouldn't show, or they wouldn't occupy any space on the page. And the text property of all these validators, I would make this text an asterisk. Okay. Let's move back to the page. Now what I need to do is for the individual validators, I would have to change their for the first email address validator, I would change the error message property of this validator to enter email address, and the control to validate property of this validator. So control to validate property will be the email address, which will be the ID of the control that it will be validating. Okay, so this makes sure that the validator is set up to validate the email address text box, and if it doesn't it is not filled, then it shows the error, it shows the asterisk and populates the error message. Enter an email address. Okay. So this validator is set up. So again, what I did is that I made its control to validate the email address field, and its error message to basically show that it's to enter an email address. And its text is just an asterisk. Its CSS class I already set up to be error message, and its display is dynamic. Okay. Now for the regular expression, the error message will be in so for the regular expression, the control to validate will be the email address again, and its error message will be enter a valid email. And again, its text is basically a star. For the compare validator, I have a compare validator that shows a let's see, where am I? Okay, for the confirm email address, I have a compare validator. Its control to validate as confirm email address, confirm email. Its control to compare is going to be the email address, which comes from top here, Okay. And its error message will be confirm email address. Oh, retype the email address. Or let's say email addresses don't match. And it compares the email address with the confirm email address text boxes. Let's bring a required field validator for this expression also, because we want to have an actual email address also typed in here, and make the CSS class and display dynamic. Let's change the text for the error message to confirm the email address. Control to validate will be equal to, again, the confirm email text box. And let me see if I have everything now set up so far. And this text is an asterisk. So again, and here I showed you how to make the changes not within the properties grid, but rather in your text or your source code. So for the first validator, for the first email address type, I had two validators, one for required field and one regular expression. So for that validators, I have the name text box. This is the name text box. I have a required field validator for this text box that basically validates the name text box, and it has the let me see, I made a mess here, I think. This is the email text box, sorry. So for the email text box, which is the email address, I have a required field validator. The control that it validates is the email address control, and its error message is enter an email address. And then I have a regular expression validator that validates email address text box, and it basically enters a valid email address for the regular expression error message. The second text box for the email, I have two validators for it, and so I have a compare validator that compares the confirm email address with the email address, and if it's not correct, it shows the error message email addresses don't match. And I have a required field validator that compares that validates the confirm email address, which is this text box, and if it's empty, it would show a confirm email address error message. Next, I would put a required field validator. I had put a required field validator for the text, comment box, and this is my text box comments, and I need to validate it. So the error message, if its validation fails, will be enter comments, and the control that it validates will be comments text box. Okay, now all is almost set. However, I need to make sure that I assign to the regular expression validator the expression that it needs to validate, or basically what kind of expression I would like it to be. To do so, I need to go to the design view, and in the design view I need to go and click on the email address, and I go to the properties grid of the email address, and I would look for the validation expression property. Actually, which one is the validation required field? And let me select the correct one. Okay, regular expression. Let's go to the validation property, validation expression property. Click on this ellipsis here, and you see several expressions that you have, and you need to click on the internet email address, and it would automatically populate your validation expression, and then you click OK. Now if you go to the source view, you will see that the validation expression has been put automatically in the source view. So now your validation is essentially set up, your page is set up to validate, and we'll run this page and see how it looks. Okay, so here is our website or web page essentially. And so remember what we did is for the name text box here, I have a required field validator. For the email, I have a required and a regular expression validator. For the confirm email, I have a required and a compare validator. And for the comments, I have a compare validator. Now if I submit the text, you'll see that I see the asterisk is here for each of these text boxes. Now let's put a name here and a comment here. And if I submit it, you see that the name validation passes, and the comments validation also passes. Now the email address and the confirm email address still show me stars, but they don't show me what are the problems with it. And that would be the validation summary that I will show you next how to do. So if you put a something in here, for example, like a name, and you click on the submit button, it would still show you the asterisk. Now this asterisk that it's showing you is the asterisk that comes from the regular field expression. And the regular field expression essentially compares the text that you entered with a pattern, which would be something @ something dot something. And you could still fake this by assigning a non-existent email address like this. This isn't really this regular expression. It does not really test for real email addresses, and but for most cases this is good enough. And so when I click the submit, I still see the confirm email asterisk showing, and the reason for it is because of its required field validator, because its required field validator at the moment checks it and says that the email is not entered here. Now if I type another set of text in it and click submit, I still see the asterisk, but now this asterisk is coming from the compare validation, comparing the email I typed in with the email that was typed in the email text box. Now notice that I don't need a required field expression here, because now I'm comparing it with the field that's already passed, and in this case I won't need it. Just a simple compare expression would do. So all I need to do is basically to type in the email address that matches with the email address I typed above, and what it does is that it compares this value with the value of the text in the email text box. And now when I submit, you see that the page was posted to the server. So after expanding your website or web page, essentially to use several types of validation controls, we saw that the 5 validation controls basically behave the same way. Actually 4 of them behave the same way, and we talked about a custom validator, and we just talked about a little bit about it, that it lets you write custom validation rules. Now, to elaborate a little bit more about that, let me just give you a couple of examples for that this validation control is useful. So the built-in validation controls were very easy to use. You would just add them to the page, as you saw, link them to the controls that you needed to validate, and they would do all of the hard work. However, these validation controls do not support every possible validation scenario that you may come up with. For example, if you wanted to have a website that has two text fields or text boxes for two phone numbers, and you want the user to enter at least one of the two phone numbers, the built-in validation controls that we saw so far cannot support this scenario. Another example is when you wanted to show a list of all the errors that users made when they were doing and entering the data. So for example, when they press the submit button, you might want to have a place in the web page that if they have made three errors or three mistakes and entering data in three of the fields, and you want to show all of those errors in a list so the user would automatically or kind of easily understand what they did wrong. And these properties are basically or these tasks and scenarios are the scenarios that you could deal with by using custom validator and validation summary controls. And I'll talk about them a little bit, and then we'll see an example of how we can use them. The custom validator control enables you to write your own custom validation functions for both client side and for server side. In the client, you can use JavaScript, which is a very simple scripting language, very similar to C#. And in the server side, you can use VB.NET or C# in the code behind files and write your own validation methods. This will give you a great deal of flexibility when you are basically validating the data and the rules that you want to apply and enforce on the data that is being entered to the server. The validation summary control provides the user with a list of errors that it retrieves from the individual validation control's error message properties and show those error messages at once. It can show the error messages in three different ways. It can use them as a list that is embedded in the page, or you can use a JavaScript alert box in a window, basically, that pops up, and then also you can combine the two at the same time. We can control this setting by basically working with show message box and show summary properties of the validation summary control. Also, this validation control has a display mode property that enables you to change the way that the list of errors is presented. By default, it shows bulleted list, and so each of the items would be one bullet in the list, but you can have other options like a list or a single paragraph and things like that. Okay, let's start up writing and enhancing our page by ensuring that at least one of the two phone numbers is entered, and then finally show all the errors that the user made with a validation summary control to provide feedback to the user in terms of all the mistakes they made. Okay, now I want to show you how we can use the custom validators and validation summary. Let's first use the validation summary control and show a summary of the validation errors that the users might make when they are entering the data. So to do that, first of all, I'll show you how to work a little bit with tables in Visual Web Developer. What we need to do is to add another cell or another row to this table and merge its three columns, so it would be one column, like the table, like the row that we have up here that says get in touch with us, and please fill the following form and stuff like that. So, and then we'll put a validation summary in it. In order to create a new row, you right-click on one cell. Basically, make sure that you right-click on an empty cell, and then go to Insert Row, and then go to Insert Row Below. And when you do that, a new row will be added to your table, and it will be added at the bottom of the table. Now click on this row and make sure that you select all the 3 cells. If they're not selected, just scroll to the right, hold down your left mouse button, and go and basically drag the mouse button all the way to the right to select all of these 3 cells, and then right click on them, and from the modify option, select merge cells, and this will merge all of these 3 cells together. Now we have the cells created for us to give us a place for the validation summary. From the validation toolbox to the left of this page, which is right here, just click on the validation summary and bring it in and put it inside the row. Okay, now within the validation summary, you need to go to the source. I'll show you how to change the CSS class of the validation summary. So in the source view, I'll just simply add the CSS class property of this validation summary and make it error message. And this way it will show the error messages of each of those failed validation controls with the style of error message, which I created in as in an embedded style. Now let's run this page. And here is my page. Now if I submit my form, you see the stars appear next to the text boxes that failed the validation, and then it essentially shows the error message of these validators. Now the first one is for the name, the second one is for the email address, asking me to enter an email address. This is for the required field validator of the confirm email address, and then this one is the enter comments, which was the validation for the comments section. Now notice that I forgot to change the error message of the required field validator for confirm email, so that's showing me the default. Let's go back to here and change that required field validator of the confirm email message and say that enter an email address. So if I run this one more time, and here's how it looks like. So now if I submit the form, the first item wants the name, the second item wants the email address, the third item wants the email address, and then the fourth item wants the comments to be selected or put. So let's get rid of the comments and the name, and let's submit. And here I'm left with the enter email address. Now if I type something that's not an email address and then I submit the form, I still see the star, but this time I'll get the error message from the regular expression validator that wants me to enter a valid email address. So for that I would put, for example, a valid email address, and I submit it. Now the confirm email address still wants the required email, and if I put something that's not equal to the confirm to the email address, the compare validator kicks in and asks me to enter an email address that matches the one that I have already typed in. So I need to make sure that the two email addresses match, and if that happens, the form is completely validated and the data will be sent to the server. Now next, I'll show you how to create a custom validator for the home and business phone number and make sure that the user enters one of the two phone numbers in, and I will just check the phone number. I could also, within that custom phone number, make sure and validate a regular expression the way that the phone number should look like, but I won't go into that detail. If you would like to do that, you can study a little bit more about regular expressions and check the regular expression of the data the user entered. So you would check to see at least one of the phone numbers are entered, and also at the same time check and see if they are of the custom of the correct validation type or correct regular expression. So for doing that, let's go back to the code and let's bring a custom validation control and put it next to the home phone number. Let's go to the design view. So the home phone number, in the cell next to it, I need to put a custom validator. So I'll bring this custom validator here, and this will be my custom validator. Now I need to make the CSS class property to be error message, the display to be dynamic. Its error message would read enter your home or business phone number. Its text would be a star, and it would have a client validation property. I'll do that and set these up in the properties grid. So the CSS class of this object will be error message. Its display I would like to be dynamic. Again, remember, dynamic makes the validator not take up any space on the web page if its validation passes. Let's make the error message read enter home or business phone number. The text would read an asterisk to show that this is a field that needs validation, and I need to go and find this client validation function, because at this point for this validator I'll make two validation processes, one on client and one on the server. It's already set up in the server. I need to just write the codes for its server-side validation, but I could also write a JavaScript that I will show you in a little bit how to write a function that would validate on the client side. For that, I need to have a function name for the client-side validation function. Let's call that function name validate phone numbers. So this will be the function that I will use and declare in the JavaScript code that I will write in the ASP file for the website in the source view. Okay, and I don't have to assign a control to validate, because within this validator I actually use two different controls to validate and make sure that at least one of them has been set up. Okay, now back on the design view, we need to click and go back to the custom validators event handler, and to create this event handler for the custom validator, you need to double click on the custom validator, and Visual Web Developer creates a event handler for it and puts it on the server side on the C# code. So when you double click on it, you will see that you'll be taken to the C# code behind file, and you will have a event handler created for this for this custom validator, it has the name of the event handler is the name of the custom validator, or its ID, underscore server validate. And it will get as input two objects. It will get a source, which basically is a reference to the event handler, to the validator itself, and it would get some arguments. And within the arguments, you will have, which are the args. These are the arguments that will be exposed, and then you could set a property called isValid, true or false, according to your own procedures for validation. So what I will do is that I will make a essentially a conditional test, and I would like to set up the isValid property of the args object to true if at least one of the text boxes for home text and home phone and business phone are not empty, and otherwise make them false. So what I could write is that I could write if the string dot is null or empty, phone business dot text and string dot is null or empty, phone home. So what this home phone home text. Okay, what this does is that this function is null or empty, or the method is null or empty of the object string is called upon the text of phone H, which is the ID of the home phone text box. So this function is called upon the text and checks to see if it is null or if it is empty. That is that if a user has not entered any phone number in that particular text box. Same thing for phone B, which was a text box for the business phone. And so if both of these are empty, so if both business phone text box and home phone text box are empty, you would like to make the args dot is valid equal false. Else args dot is valid equals true. Okay. So here we have actually made the validation function, which is very, very simple and straightforward. We check to see if the text box of the home phone box and business phone box are empty, both of them, and if both of them are empty or are null, then we set the isValid property to false, otherwise we set it to true. When that happens, your validation essentially gets, your custom validator validates basically the conditions that you check, and if the conditions are met, basically if one of the text box is not empty, it would validate and make the isValid property of that validator true. And this way, your validation summary would recognize the validation has passed and wouldn't show any error message. And if if both of the text boxes are empty, which is if statement is true, then the isValid property of your validator will be false, and therefore your data would not be processed in the server, and at the same time a star or an asterisk will be shown on the browser because the validator text was a asterisk, and also the summary validator or the validation summary control will show the error message of this validator that you set up. previously. Now next is to write your client-side JavaScript, and I'll walk you through the writing of this JavaScript, and I'll show you how it works for those of you who are not familiar with JavaScript. So save this code behind file, and then we'll go to the default.aspx and we click on the source code. Now right before your table, essentially within the div element, you need to create a JavaScript. To create a JavaScript, the tag for JavaScript is called script. And then you would like to mention what type of script this is, so you type in type equals text / JavaScript. So now your JavaScript tag is set up for you to write any JavaScript function you would like to write. Now you would need to create a function that you already gave the name for your validator to run. So when your validator is processing data, it looks for the function name that you gave to its client function, client validate function, and if it finds this function in your JavaScript, it would run it. So you create a function. It doesn't have to return anything, so it won't have any return value, and the name of this function is validate phone numbers. Validate phone numbers. Make sure that the validate phone numbers is exactly spelled the same as the function that you put in your custom validator's client validation function. This function gets two pieces of information, a source and an args. Okay. Now, when you close the curly brace, your Visual Web Developer automatically recognizes that this is going to be a body of the function, and what it will do for you is that it will put the curly brace back in front of the function. That's how Visual Web Developer by default essentially pre-populates and creates the JavaScript functions. If you would have the curly brace have their own line, you could go to Tools and Options from the main menu and then expand the text editor, JavaScript formatting, and then choose New Line Category. Okay, we'll leave it at this, and here within this function I will create two variables, and I will put in one variable the phone number for the home text box, and in the other variable I would put the phone number for the business text box, and then I check to see if these variables are empty or not. Pretty much the same thing I did on the server side. The coding is just a little bit different. So to declare a variable in JavaScript, you just type in var, and then you give it a variable name, and then you do the same for, let's make this phone home and phone biz. Okay. Now I created my variables. Now I need to put values in these variables. So what I can do is that I can ask the document, basically the web page that I am in, to send me an element by looking for this element's ID. So the document class has a method called getElementById, which would return in turn to me the elements that I give the ID to. And because these elements IDs are on the server, I should use basically a server-side scripting, which starts with less than and percent and equal sign. So this less than percent is essentially a server-side scripting thing. So to put everything together, so I put in the phone home value, from document, I ask for get element by ID. And what ID do I need? I need an ID that comes from the server and is equal to phone B, phone H dot client ID. So what it is that I'm requesting the values that are assigned to the object phone home, which is here. Let me find it. Phone home, which is this element, and I want its client ID to be returned to me, because this script is run on the client side in the basically in your web browser. You can't just simply, like on the server side, what we did here, I just called phone h.text. I can't do that on my client side, because on the client side there's no such thing as phone h. Its ID will be automatically processed by your browser, by your web server, and a client ID will be created. And when the web server is creating the final HTML file and markup, it would put a client ID of this phone text, phone h. So what you need to do is you want to get the value of the element that whose server side name is phone h, but its client ID will be different, and you would get phone h.client ID values, because you're calling the get element by its ID. So that way your phone home is populated, and now you want to populate your phone biz. You pretty much do the same thing. You do the same thing. You call up on document dot get element by ID, and then you call up a server-side script here and request the phone B client ID, whatever client ID phone B has. Now that you have this script written and you populated your home phone and business phone, all you need to do is just to run a simple check to see if phone biz dot value is equal empty, and check to see if it is equal empty, and phone home dot value is equal empty. If that happens, you put args dot is valid equal false, else args is valid equal true. So now you check the phone biz.value and phone home.value and make sure if both of them are empty, you make args is valid false, otherwise args is valid will be true. This will be your JavaScript in the ASPX web form. Okay, save this. Okay, great. Now let's run our web page. And so here's the web page. If I click submit button, you'll see that all of these validations are occurring, and so I need to put a name. So the first line says type your name, enter an email address, enter email an email address, and finally the home phone and business phone custom validation asks me to enter home or business phone numbers, and then the comment wants the comment. So let's just populate all these other options, and let's focus on our business and home phone number. So I deliberately left the home phone and business phone empty, and I showed the text, which was the asterisk, saying that I need to do something about it, and my validation summary asks me to enter home phone or business phone numbers in. Now, there's one single note about the validation that is happening here. Notice here, if I click on my browser and go to Tools and then go to Options, on the Content section, I have disabled JavaScript. Okay, so but the validation is showing me that the validation basically failed, and that is because my JavaScript is not run on the web server here, on the client here, but actually this server-side validation has passed. Now let me show you what happens here if I didn't validate on the server. So if I had not written the validation process on the server in the code behind file with my C# code here, and if I had run this page essentially without the server-side validation, I'll type the name, I'll type the email address, I retype the email address, I leave these two empty, and I type a comment and I submit, and the page gets submitted to the server, and the server would process this page. Okay, now to show you how bad it might be, let me just show you what happens here, that actually the server does process the information. Now let's assume that I would put the home phone number into the comment text box, and this is just a simple function that I will write to show you actually how to use the isValid property of your page and make sure that you let the server run your program when the page is valid. Basically, that means that all the validation has passed. So if I double click in the design view, double click on the submit button, essentially create the functionality of my program, and I test to see if my page is valid. So I'm checking to see if my page is valid, and if so, I would put the comments.text equals all's well. Okay, now see what happens here. If I run this page, now if I click submit, my server side is checking all the validations, and notice that the client side fails to validate the home or business phone number. So let's assume that the person typed the name, typed the email address, typed another email address, left those blank, and typed something for the comment box, and if they run, you would see that the server thinks that all is well. Now instead of just this simple all is well, the server may have been processing this data, and basically may have needed to work with the phone or business numbers and retrieve some information. Because they're non-existent, then it might break the website. So what happens if I go and enable my JavaScript by going on Tools, Options, and Enable JavaScript? Now the server does not run the information for me, and would the client machine, and it would need a home or business phone number, because now the client side has been activated. And when I submit it, then it thinks that all is well, because now the page is valid. Now for this reason, you would have to make sure that you will basically write your server-side validations as well. And you let just the client-side validation to be a easy way for those users who enable their client-side validation, because it takes over and that would run the validation before the page is sent to the server. And let the server also re-evaluate and revalidate everything. So now I enabled my, I actually wrote my server-side validation. Now you see that the server-side, the client-side took over and validated because the JavaScript is enabled. And if the JavaScript was disabled, and I would still try to submit this form, now the server would not allow me to validate or to enter. And then I would have to basically enter the phone or business number, and when the server has everything, then it shows me that all is well. Now, one last comment, one last thing that I have to say here in terms of validation is to show you that you could actually use the show summary of the property of your validation summary and show message box of your validation summary to essentially enable it to either show the list on the web page or open a little alert window telling you that you're required to put validations. So for this, click on the default and then go to the design view and then click on your validation, your validation summary box, and in the properties window of the validation summary control, you will see the show message box and show summary. So let's go to the properties window and let's go to the show message box and show summary. So right now show summary is true, which shows the summary as bulleted list, and show message box is false. You could make the show message box true and show summary false, and in this sense you would basically create a message box instead of the list on the browser. Now we need to set the header text property of the message box as well. That would tell us what we need to do. Basically we can say please correct the following errors before you pass the information to the server. Colon. Okay, now let's see what happens if we do this. Let's run the page and let's submit. And when you submit the page, okay, here we are, the page. So let's submit the page. When you submit the page, it shows you that these are all the errors that are happening, and it will show you the error message. Oh, yeah, it's probably because the client JavaScript is disabled. Yeah, so now if I press the submit button, it shows me the header, which is please correct the following errors before you press the information to the server, and those are the errors that I made. So if you noticed, when my JavaScript was disabled, this message box would not show up because it's a client-side script, the message box. I still would get the text here, but my validation summary would not show me the message box because it cannot run JavaScript codes which renders the box. So another note to keep in mind, if you're, instead of using your summary, your show summary of the validation summary, and instead you're using show message box, you need to make sure that the client side has JavaScript enabled. So for this reason, good practice would be to set both show summary properties of your summary validation summary control and show message box to true if you would like to run the message box. So let's run the program one more time. And if I submit, I would get both the message box here and the message summary in the browser. And if my client server JavaScript was disabled, I would still get the summary text. I wouldn't get the message box. You could manipulate and work with the way that you want your essentially the list to be displayed. So let me show you here back in the validation summary box. The display mode is bulleted list. You could have it single paragraph, you could have it a list, and that would show your validations differently. So let's go back, let's make it single paragraph, and let's go back to the browser and run our page. Here we are in the browser. When I click on the submit button, the error summaries would be shown in a paragraph. And let's enable the JavaScript to get so here the error is now basically in a paragraph mode, or I could set it up to be a list, and then when I run the page, now I would get just a list without the preceding bullets. Okay, so this is all I have about your validation controls, and we have set up this this website or web page that asks the user to enter their name, email address, confirm their email addresses, type in at least one phone number, and type in the comments, and then pressing submit button. Now, what happens next? Next would be to write a more programs to basically allow the users to submit their comments by sending an email. Now, this topic will be the topic of our next week's lecture, and I will show you how you can create, how you can understand the request validation properties, and how you can process the data at server and send your emails from the website, basically. And I'll show you how to create an email message. I will set these up also to show you how you could basically bypass the emailing process and make your emails sent to your local machine or local host, which would be your computer if you don't have a web host actually. But if you do have a web host that enables you and allows you to put ASP.NET files on, I will show you how you can use real emails, and I'll show you how these emails sending back and forth would work. And also I'll show you how to basically send emails from the contact form user by reading some basic information from a text file that you set up as a template for your email, and then just fill in the template with the data that is entered by the user, instead of just sending raw information in. And that would conclude this section, this part of our class.